for our first discussion, thinking about Naomi, what draws us to great stories, whether in movies or in books? What tends to draw you to a great story? And yes, this does tie into Naomi and her calling herself Mara.
Good characters.
Good characters? All right, what do you mean by good characters? Are we talking morally good?
They're interesting. They're relatable.
Okay.
And the word we're looking for, or the phrase we're looking for there, is a good character arc, where they evolve over time.
Okay.
They can overcoming obstacles.
Overcoming obstacles, yes, that is part of it. Both static and dynamic characters, people who go through a character arc, people who don't go through a character arc, can overcome obstacles. What else?
Interesting plot.
All right, an interesting plot, yeah. Sometimes a story can be carried by very interesting characters, but the plot might be boring. But if the plot is good, it kind of needs good characters to go along with it. And so, as Joy kind of preempted us, the two basic categories in stories we hear, and this is fairly universal, are called static characters and dynamic characters. And this is, as I said, universal in literature. Now, can anybody reach back into elementary, middle school, high school, where you learned some basic storytelling, plots, arcs, and remember what static and dynamic means in relation to a character? Apparently nobody paid very well attention. Yes, Joy, the professor of literature.
Yes, the person who lectured on it can. So a static character is a character who does not have what we would think of as a personal arc. They do not have something inside them to overcome. If you're familiar with Star Wars, Luke Skywalker in the first film is a good example. He's a good character who wants to fight bad guys, and at the end, he's a good character who wants to fight bad guys. There's nothing in the middle for him to internally overcome. A dynamic character or a rounded character is a character that has some internal struggle they must overcome, like Luke Skywalker in the third Star Wars movie, where he wants to save his father, but also he's feeling this draw to evil because evil is easier than good, and he must overcome that internal struggle to succeed as the hero.
Yes.
That was really good.
I had to teach it several times.
Yes. Yes, and so one of the things that plays into static and dynamic characters, if we picked it up from the subtext of Joy's response, is static characters tend not to change throughout the story. They are consistent, they are just kind of baseline. As Joy had said, Luke Skywalker starts off as a good farming kid who wants to fight bad guys, and by the end of the movie, he is still a good farming kid who wants to fight bad guys. But a dynamic character is one who does personally change throughout the arc of the story. And we see both static and dynamic characters even in biblical literature. And so looking at the book of Ruth, we really have three primary characters. Yes, there are more people who are named, but our three primary characters that follow us throughout almost the entirety of the story are Naomi, Boaz, and Ruth. Now, thinking through what you might remember from the book of Ruth, would Ruth herself be a static character or a dynamic character? Yeah, she really doesn't change. She is committed to Naomi. She wants to provide for them. And by the end of the story, she has accomplished this. She is dedicated to Naomi. She has married Boaz. Spoilers if you've never read the book of Ruth. And there's nothing else. Boaz, is he a static or a dynamic character? Now, he really doesn't change. He is an honorable man who wants to reward Ruth for her commitment to Naomi, and he wants to provide for them. And that's pretty much his whole shtick throughout the story of Ruth. Now, neither of these two characters, despite being static, means that they are uninteresting, boring characters. They are still important to the story. But our third character, Naomi, is the only dynamic character in the book of Ruth. She's the only one who changes throughout the story. And some would say, I'm not quite sure where I land on this, but some would say Naomi is really the protagonist of the story. She's really the main character, not Ruth. Because Naomi is the one who drives the plot. She's the one who instigates a lot of what needs to go on. She is oftentimes telling Ruth what to do. And so Ruth doesn't always exhibit agency throughout the story, except in one instance that I can think of off the top of my head. And so I do want to, at least for chapter 2, to focus a little bit on Naomi's arc throughout the story. So from what you can remember from chapter 1, as we get into chapter 2, how has Naomi's character development been portrayed throughout chapter 1? How would you say she might have started off the story? And some of this might have to be a little bit taking from inference.
Probably neutral. I mean,
Mhm.
just an average Israelite woman whose husband's taken her to Moab.
Okay.
Just dealing with the day in, day out, not really happy about it, but this is what we gotta do.
So it's possible, she started off, we would say perhaps content. I mean, she's married. Her husband owns land. But then we get the change where there is famine in the land, and she and her husband must move. Now, we are not told what their attitudes were about it. I'm sure we can kind of guess how they might have been feeling about it. But they are also blessed with 2 sons, and 2 sons who eventually marry. So even though they're not in their home country, life is currently sounding pretty good, all things considered. Joy, you look like you had something to talk about.
Oh, I was just going to add, although name meanings do not necessarily indicate anything about personality, says the depressed person named Joy, there is this narrative contrast that Naomi sets up for herself because her name means pleasant, and then she shifts to Mara, which means bitter.
Yes, and that is where I chose to title our first slide, playing off of a little bit from the great opening to Moby Dick, Call Me Ishmael, to Call Me Mara, which is actually in the biblical text. That is how it is literally rendered, so I thought it was a good connection. But yes, her character arc is defined by her wanting to change her name. But it is also interesting that nobody else calls her Mara throughout the entire book. Everybody, including the narrator of the book, is always calling her Naomi. So for her, anyways, this is a very internal change. That she has started off, we might consider, very neutral, normal, probably very pleased. She is blessed with 2 sons. And in that ancient world, it goes without saying that having sons was far more desirable than having daughters, because sons could increase the prestige and the wealth of your house, whereas daughters, you had to, in some ways, offload them onto another family, because ultimately they would not be bringing in any sort of revenue besides the marriage dowry. Because you would also have to pay the other family to essentially take my daughter to marry. A very harsh way of putting it, but marriage, up until really the last 100, 200 years, was a very economic consideration, not so much a consideration out of love. So things are going well, but then all the male members of her immediate family die. And she is now, for all intents and purposes, left destitute. And so how does she describe this? So she has said when she wants to be called Mara that God has dealt bitterly with her. What else does she say about how God has treated her?
my life very bitter.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord has brought me back empty.
Mm-hmm.
The hand of the Lord is against me.
Yeah. That her change seems to be going from one of either nominal or genuine belief in Yahweh as the God of Israel to God is malevolent, at least in terms of how he deals with me. She doesn't see God as a friend and as a protector. She sees God as the one who is essentially cursing her. That God, for whatever reason, no longer likes her. And these are pretty harsh accusations. And so for a moment, should Naomi be condemned for her feelings of dejection and how she has expressed it? No? Why no?
It's just human nature, and God knows it. He can handle it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just feelings. I don't know how else to put it. It's just like God knows you're going to get mad because you don't understand His ways, but
Mm-hmm.
are upset. But that doesn't mean you're a bad person or you're turning your back on God. You're just not happy right now.
Mm-hmm.
And God designed us with the emotions to need to grieve and need to, He didn't design us to go through that kind of stuff and then just say, oh, I'm content, I'm happy. I mean, something would, a psychologist would say something's wrong with you because that's not normal human emotion. Now we add God into it, but still we need to give ourselves the ability to grieve and to know that God gave us these emotions. I was just talking to my daughter yesterday about, the fire. She's evacuated. She still isn't back yet. She says, everybody's saying, oh, you're so lucky because her house is still standing. She goes, and then absolutely no, I'm lucky, but I have smoke damage. I have ash everywhere. I can't go back to my house until it's clean. And I was just telling her that same thing. I said, God made you to grieve, and you need to give yourself permission to do that, to grieve. And then, I mean, we can't forever grieve. You have to step back up. And that's what I see. I see, I don't think any condemnation at this point. If in a year she's still saying the same thing, then it's like, okay, let's have a conversation about this.
Okay. So, yeah, and that is important to remember, that this is a woman who is grieving, that she's lost her husband, she's lost her sons, that in that world, her daughters-in-law, they have no legal or marital ties to her anymore. They have no obligation to stay with her, even though it sounds like, at least initially, they both wanted to stick around with her. And she tells them, no, no. And why does she push them away? Because that is what she's doing. She's pushing her, what was her family away. What does she tell them?
They need new husbands and she can't provide that for them, so she's trying to push them away. The text doesn't say it, but I wonder if there's anything in her that feels guilty or to blame for the fact that they left in the first place. And is God punishing her for all that? Because I know that when we come across hard times, we could be like, is this all my fault because of things that I did? Is God punishing me?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Oh yeah, all, again, speculation, but it's not, it's not outside the realm of possibility that she could be thinking these things. Because when people are grieving and just all this horrible thing is happening to them, you begin to question, the events leading up to this.
She could blame God, she could blame both.
Yeah, and without any sons, there's no way to provide for her. She's, by her own admission, she's too old to have children, again, for her daughters who are still young and who need that financial support from men and from the family ties that would come with it, but also legal representation in that world. Yes, a woman could go into the gate of a city to make a case. This is something that we do see that happened at least during the time of Moses, where the women go up him and say, hey, what happens to our property if all of our family descendants are lost? Because according to the current laws, it would go to the next male heir. And if there are no male heirs, then it goes to our extended family who might not care for us. And Moses does say, all right, then the property stays with you. But even though there's that provision, we must remember Israel is not faithful. There's no guarantee they would still operate this way. And suffice it to say, men were taken a lot more seriously. We even see hints of this in the Psalms. In Psalm 127, 3 through 5, it says, better are sons, to have in the gate. Because sons, men are what's driving the world at this time. And this is a reality of their situation.
I don't think we really can have the grasp of how serious that is. And a guy that we worked with in Egypt, he left his wife and daughter in Egypt. This is just recent. And she needed to get a transcript from the school. She went to the school and they said, no, your husband has to get it. My husband's in the United States. No, you cannot. She said, bring your brother-in-law or your uncle, but you, mother, that has all the rights, may not get a transcript from the school. And that's today. So, but it's the same idea as back then in the Middle East. It's just women had no rights. And now Israel, Mosaic law tried to change that. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it's that they have nothing. There is land that they still own, but it's been 10 years. It's not cultivated, it's not ready to produce anything, and it's not like they're able to work it. So they have nothing. Of course Naomi's dejected, of course she's depressed. But this is something where we also need to look at a little bit of the literature of the text, because she has lost all these things, and she blames God for it. Though in the text, it never says God did these things. So first and foremost, why would she blame God when, at least in how the narrator has written the story, none of these things, it never says God was the agent of these things.
It's like she knew enough to know that God's in control of everything, so therefore it must be his fault.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Seems like the focus is on the physical universe completely.
Yes, in the book of Ruth, and there are some commentators who mention that they're like, except for speech, God is not a quote-unquote character in the book of Ruth. He doesn't do anything, and yet he is credited and blamed for everything. Because even though he's not a quote-unquote character...
Well, that's where you have hope for God. You get into the spiritual universe when you're wrapped up in the physical universe so tight, you start looking into the spiritual universe for a direction.
That is true. That is some...
Because there's relief in that. Staying in the physical universe, there's a lot of pain and suffering.
There is. But the physical universe is not divorced from, to borrow the phrase, the spiritual universe. Because both in their minds, and as the Bible attests, the two are very tied together. That God is over all these things. That God is sovereign over all events. And so, while there might be different immediate causes for the things that happen to us, God is seen as the ultimate cause of why things happen in the world. And this is, the lesson that we learn from the book of Job, that, the narrator kind of clues us in to what is going on in the life of Job, and they're like, it is, the adversary, the Satan, who is afflicting Job with all these terrible things. And yet, Job focuses his attention on God himself. And God does not say, hey, that wasn't me. He says, do you not trust with how I'm handling the world? Because I do more things than you are aware of. I even oversee things that have no direct bearing on you or anyone else. And so, even though God is not present as a character in the book of Ruth, Ruth's philosophy of why these things are happening to her is still correct. That, for whatever reason, this famine has come. Her sons and her husband have been taken away by God's ordination for whatever reason. And so she does choose to call herself Mara, and I got a little ahead of myself on this slide. But she's not necessarily wrong in saying God has done these things to me, but what she believes and what is dangerous to focus on for so long is God must hate me. And that's why all these bad things are happening. Because that does claim to know what God is doing. But Naomi doesn't know what God is doing yet. So they return to Israel. And Ruth offers to go glean in the fields of the farm that she finds favor in. And she does qualify this. Says, please, Naomi, allow me to go into the fields to glean, in the place where I find favor. Now, for anyone, who's either familiar with this story or agricultural language, what does it mean to glean?
Pick up the leftovers.
Yeah, you're picking up the leftovers. You are not the one harvesting. You're the one going along and saying, oh, what was dropped and left behind? You're not necessarily begging, but this is pretty close to begging. And so...
That's why Naomi
Mhm.
didn't offer to glean some of the fields?
Why Naomi did not?
Not physically strong enough? Or?
That's one speculation. I would assume that she's not at the age where she can do this, or at least can't do it easily. She might also just be depressed. I mean, if anyone has ever, undergone just severe depression, it takes like this superhuman exertion just to sit up in bed. And so, these are all things that could be going on. We're not told why. But Ruth, showing her devotion to Naomi, says, I will go. Now, I would imagine this might be difficult because gleaning, again, you're picking up the leftovers. You're not exactly, getting a whole lot. So Ruth has to collect enough for both her and another person to survive on. So this is pretty bad. But why might Ruth qualify that she is concerned that she finds favor in a field and that's the one she'll go to? Why might she be concerned about finding favor?
She's a Moabite, a foreigner.
All right, she's a Moabite, she's a foreigner.
Young, beautiful.
Woman.
Yep, she's young, beautiful. Joy?
Well, yes, all of those things. One, she's a foreigner, so she's going to be discriminated against.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be something that would culturally be encouraged. It's not like she's going to find community with the other gleaners.
Yes.
And also, and this might be just the way I was socialized as a woman, but if you're a young single woman, the world is scary because, as you say, women are not believed in this time if something happens to them.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
because she's a foreigner and thought of as less than, there's an even greater danger of someone being like, oh, it won't matter if I do
Right.
something to her.
And sometimes it's a positive to be beautiful, but sometimes it's a negative.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
if she wasn't that good looking, they might not pay attention to her.
Yes.
Yeah.
That really is what's the phrase, catch-22.
It is.
And again, this is during the period of the judges. Now, we don't know exactly when this occurred during the period of the judges. We have kind of a rough, estimate based on the chronology that's at the end of chapter 4. But does anybody remember some of the events that occurred at the end of the book of Judges? And specifically how it involved women.
It was the Levite and his concubine.
Mm-hmm. So there's the Levite's concubine. So the Levites passing through a town in Benjamin, and in a story that is purposely written to be eerily similar to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that the men of Benjamin bang on the door asking for, to them, these two foreigners to come out so that they might get to know them, which is a euphemism in the Bible for
Right.
sex and rape. And this Levitical priest says, don't take me, take my servant woman, sends her out, and they gang rape her, and she dies.
This guy.
And the Levitical priest comes out the next morning, kind of sees her body, and you can almost imagine him kicking her, saying, all right, get up, let's go. And then it goes, oh, she's dead. And this starts off a mini civil war in Israel against the tribe of Benjamin, where the Levitical priest kind of plays up what happened to her, hacks up her body, sends her different body parts around to the different tribes and says, look what these Benjamites have done. And they come, and the Israelites come, and they almost destroy the entire tribe of Benjamin, and then they go, oh, what have we done? There is not enough women here now to help repopulate the tribe of Benjamin. They will go extinct. And so they go into a neighboring village and abduct all the young women and give them to the Benjamite men so that they might have additional wives to repopulate. Again, written, I think, very eerily as a parallel to the legendary story of the Romans called the rape of the Sabine women, where roughly the same thing happens. And apparently this was a fairly common type of story because it probably happened fairly often. So I don't know if this is before or after this period of time, but the threat is real for Naomi. And so it describes her in chapter 2 that she has gone to glean in this field, and it just so happened to belong to a man named Boaz. Now, this is a very interesting phrase. Why would the narrator say that it just so happened? What might be meant by this phrase?
They didn't know ahead of time.
All right, they didn't know ahead of time. But where this is a little odd, and I do have the scene here for a purpose, that a great line from the Muppet Christmas Carol, where Gonzo, in the role of Charles Dickens, is describing the story. He's narrating the story, talking about Scrooge now going around, looking in all the dark corners of his house after being scared by the ghost of Marley having taken the place of the knocker on his door. And Rizzo the rat goes, hey, how do you know what Scrooge is doing? We're down here and he's up there. To which he says, storytellers are omniscient. I know everything. And you see this in narration, even in biblical literature. We are given insight into a person's thoughts. And it's especially weird, if that person's dead, how did they know what they were thinking? So either they are filling in the details, or it has been revealed to them in some aspect. We not necessarily sure how the natural processes of them getting communicated, that information is there, but it's there. We are given more information than the characters are, and yet the narrator here decides to forego an omniscient perspective to a perspective that is kind of, through the eyes and the knowledge of Ruth. Now, why might that be? Joy, I thought. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to add that this doesn't answer your question.
Mhm.
It's one of these both, it's kind of, it's a moment where we see God's sense of humor in the structure of the biblical narrative. Because yes, after Naomi, in her deep grief, going, God has taken everything from me, God has done this, and as you said, we don't see God as a character here. But Ruth just happened to go to the field of the man she needed to go to bring about continue the line towards Christ.
Yes. That's not intentional, and by Ruth's kind of own statements later on in the book and her surprise, she wasn't expecting for them to run into Boaz. And I would imagine that she might have thought everyone's dead. Like, I have no family relations. And to me, I think that's why she is then excited when Ruth tells her whose field that she has found herself in. And so this phrase that she just so happened to end up is a phrase that only occurs here in Ruth and in one other place in Ecclesiastes 2:14 through 15. And it indicates that this was all by chance, without any sort of forethought on the part of Ruth. So there was no scheming, there was no like, oh, hey, we've got a family member, why don't you go over there and look pretty? They had no idea. And yet, as Joy says, even though God is not a stated character in the story, God is still the one who is orchestrating these things when they are not even aware of what's going on.
Except when it was tongue in cheek, which I think is what you're saying. It's like my version says, as it turned out,
Yeah.
he was in the field. You know what I mean? It's like, who made it turn out that way?
Yeah, it's a lot of times this perspective is to kind of put us in the place of the character, have a little bit of a sense of humor with it. But it's, not going like, the narrator is not trying to reveal too many details early. He is trying to keep us in the tension of the narrative. But she goes to his field, and before she meets him, something occurs in the field, and we're not exactly sure. Because in chapter 2, verse 7, there's a very odd sentence at the end, where one of the servants of Boaz is telling him that, hey, this Moabite woman, Ruth, she has now come, and she has done such and such and so and so. And you'll see this often translated in many different ways, because all I can say is bad grammar. Very bad grammar. Because it literally says that Ruth came, and she stood from then, the morning, and until now this, her sitting in the house or structure, a little. And a lot of people go, what? And so there's a couple ways that this is constructed. Again, the syntax, how the individual words and prepositions relate to another is not super clear. And so some will translate it as, so she came and remained here. From morning until now, she has stopped only a moment. Others might translate it, she came and has stood here from this morning until now. She's been sitting or resting in the house for a short time. Now, option number one, what do you think the servant might be conveying if it's translated that way?
She's a hard worker.
Yeah, she's a hard worker. She's been here, she's been in the field all day, she's been in here morning, has only stopped for a little bit. So she has been working. Option number two, what might the servant be communicating?
She doesn't know what to do. She's just standing there.
Okay, she might not know what to do. She's just standing there.
She's isolating herself from the other people in the field.
Okay. But I mean, other people, like there's other people who are gleaning in the field and she's not. Why might she not be gleaning?
Waiting to find favor, get explicit permission maybe.
Yeah, she might not have been given permission. I mean, the servants of the house, they can give permission. They have that authority. And so some think, the servants have been putting her off all day until Boaz kind of gives the all clear. And so some take it this way, where if it's option number one, that if she was not allowed, that they're going like, well, if she wasn't allowed, then why didn't she just move on to another field? Why did she stay here? And so that's why some say, no, she's been working all day. Like, that doesn't make sense. Others who go with the servants just haven't given her permission would point to the fact that Ruth did say she would only glean if she found favor in that field. Maybe she didn't find a favor in any other field. And Boaz explicitly gives her that permission and that favor. And so some would say that Boaz says, yes, go ahead, stay close to the reapers, so be at the front of the line of gleaning. Some would take that to be like the first instance that she has been allowed to glean. Now, this doesn't really change the story. I think option one makes a lot more sense. I don't see why she wouldn't have just moved on. And normally, if in these types of stories, you have the classic, like 3 sets of happenstance. Option number 1 fails, option number 2 fails, and then they finally do it a 3rd time and then it works. I would have expected to have seen something like that in the story. But we didn't, so I think it's option 1. It doesn't make a big difference. But just so you know, this might be why some of your translations differ, because there's really no consensus about how this should be rendered. It could go either way.
What translation is the second one in, do you know?
It is from another commentator, so I got kind of these 2 options from a commentary.
Yeah.
But I know the ESV tends, if I recall, tends to go with option number 1, same with NET.
I have the NIV and it's 1.
Yeah.
I'm close to it.
Mm-hmm. I think the RSV and some other scholars go with option number 2.
What kind of permission did Ruth need to have to be able to sit and rest in a structure of a house? And not just sit out in the hot sun and in the field?
And so that's where some would say, option 2 doesn't make sense. Why isn't it a house? Like, why would they say it's the house? But some would then push back and go, it wasn't uncommon for there to be some sort of lean-to structure out in a field. So with workers, they're not having to trudge all the way back to the house. They could just stay out there and rest. And so some would say she's just in this kind of temporary structure out in the field, resting, getting out of the sun. So again, it's lots of back and forth on this. But regardless, Boaz arrives. She finds favor in his eyes. And so in what ways has she now received, as I would call, exceptional favor from Boaz?
So I want to believe option 1 because
Mm-hmm.
it makes her a hard worker.
Mhm.
And Boaz was kind to her for that reason, not just because she was beautiful.
Yeah.
Might be wrong, but,
Probably
it
thought she
sounds,
was hot too.
it sounds like the workers said,
Mm-hmm.
hey, that's Ruth, and she came with Naomi, and she's been working hard all day and just took a short break, and he was like, oh, wow, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just like, wow, she's beautiful.
Yeah.
He asked him, who is she? And
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. It's like, look, this is who she is.
Yes.
She showed up. She
Mhm.
worked all day.
Yeah.
So he's like, oh, so you're a good character and
Yes.
you're doing what you need to do.
Mhm.
Yes.
So he lets her glean there and he lets her get water,
Okay.
which,
Yeah, so there's no delay in when she can gather. So she's not back of the line. She doesn't have to just wait until all the servants have finished their work and then she goes through. She is allowed to be right there, right behind them, picking up, first picks. There are no restrictions on where she can gather. So in Levitical law, it was normally the edges of the field that the poor were allowed to go into and be able to pick off of what was left over. The Levitical law stated to farmers, you can't pull 100% of your produce off your field. It is a mandatory, in modern terms, a mandatory welfare program for the poor. You have to give these things to them. The workers were also told, leave out some stuff for her. So not only is she picking up her own stuff, he's having some of his workers leave some things behind for her. I think for some of us, most importantly, workers aren't allowed to touch her. It tells them, leave her alone. So I don't know what that says about Boaz's trust in his workers. It might have just been a precaution. But he's like, yeah, don't touch her. Let her be. Let her be. Let her work. Don't shoo her off or do anything else. And as one of us was saying here, that she's allowed to drink from the same water supply as the male workers. Now, there wasn't provisions for water that I'm aware of in Levitical law, that whatever water that you were going to drink, you had to get it yourself. And so this is just another, don't leave, go to a well, get something, drink, and then come back, and you're going to lose a lot of time doing that. Just drink from what we've already gotten. And you get to drink from the same supply, not a separate supply.
Was all this work primarily done by only male workers?
There were some female workers, yes, but male workers tended to be the ones who would work out in the fields. She was also allowed, after the hard day, come on in, have a meal with us. And so she's allowed to eat as if a member of the household and the serving staff. And then for some of us, best over, she gets to take home leftovers. So she gets way more than she came for. And so why has Boaz given Ruth such favor? Because, he's not doing this for anyone else.
Well, she's a family member.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something. And so as you're sitting here talking, and he's rehearsing what she did for Naomi, coming out, and he says all of this stuff. So he obviously knows it. I'm kind of surprised that he's still sending her out in the field. I mean, I know this is all good, and Boaz is a good character and a godly man and everything, but family means so much in this culture. He knows his family member is in need, and he's very wealthy, so why doesn't he just take? I mean, sorry about, I hadn't thought that before.
But he is helping her in a way that keeps her,
working and able to provide, and I get that, but it just seems like,
Well, he's a kinsman redeemer, but there's another one.
yeah, there is somebody closer, but still, it doesn't matter if you're my family, come in, I will take care of you, Anyway, I don't know, and that's off the subject.
We don't.
that's interesting.
We don't know why
Yeah,
that he's not.
but he is being very favorable, obviously, to her.
I would say it would make a lot more sense if he did that for Naomi, but we do have to remember Ruth technically isn't his family anymore.
So it could just be part of her seeing her work hard and her beauty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But at least as far as what's stated in the text, is that she asks him, "Why have you given me such favor?" So she begs the question, "Why have you done this?"
Surprised,
And Boaz answers her that all that you have done for your mother-in-law, since the death of your husband, has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge.
Which there, he's giving the Lord credit.
Yeah.
You know, he's sharing God with her
Mhm.
and showing how generous God is and his faith. It's pretty big.
And so, in his mind, what he has stated is that her commitment to Ruth and her willingness to come to Israel as a complete stranger, and at least by his kind of inference statement that God is the God of Israel, possibly with the assumption that God can't help you over in Moab, but you've now come here. Because there was a sense that the gods were more geographically located in certain areas in that time period, so he might be conveying that worldview. But he's like, but you've come here, you've come to the place of the Lord, where the Lord's people are. And by choosing to associate with us, you are by extension choosing to associate with Yahweh. And so commitment to Ruth, and in his mind, a display of faith in God, is why he has chosen to show her such favor. Which might mean that if she didn't, had no commitment to Ruth, he probably wouldn't have done any of these things. But she did. And again, none of this was with any sort, she did none of this with any sort of forethought to, I'm going to get something out of this if I do this. No, she did it out of a genuine love for Naomi. And she has just so happened to be rewarded for it.
Another thing that, just aside on this, is how fast the news.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, she probably hasn't been here long because they don't have any food. And
I would imagine she hasn't been here long.
yeah, but everybody knows, the workers all know, that's Ruth, Naomi's, and they know the whole story.
A suburb of a suburb, how many Moabite women come and live there?
Yeah. And very different to us. They live in a very communal culture.
Yeah.
Your life is spent out of the house. And so you're interacting with everyone every day. Your business is reliant on another neighbor's business, and they're reliant on another person. So it is very much its own ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so when something happens in one area, news spreads fast.
I don't think it hurts that she was beautiful.
Yeah.
Because, I work with kids, right, high school kids. A new high school boy comes in the other night, and then I'm walking around, I go to a small group of girls, and they're like, who's the new guy?
Yeah.
They
They
want
all
to know
wanna know.
instantly, because they're sick of the guys that they grew up with at the church. There's a brand new guy here.
A new boy.
Fresh blood in the water.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, it was always
It was
really
noticed.
exciting in elementary school. It's like, there's a new kid coming.
Yeah.
It's human nature to see beauty in everything.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And what you see beauty in, so
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm just saying,
I
it
don't
didn't
doubt
hurt.
that Boaz
Yeah.
definitely saw her.
Adam?
beauty.
Does the text ever call her beautiful? I mean, we can insinuate. I mean, probably she's not,
Did you see the picture?
Yes.
But she's
No, I
also
think
white in that
I-
picture, so I'm not sure we can see that as.
Yeah.
because elsewhere in Scripture, it's very quick to say, Esther was gorgeous, but Ruth is just, she's just a woman who fears the Lord.
I thought it did.
But she's.
I can't think of anywhere that it does. I think that is one of the things where it's assumed because she is still young and of marrying age.
Well, and because she's Moabite, she probably had features that were different and looked appealing.
Yep.
But, we're reading into it.
I mean, the text certainly doesn't say she was ugly. When things tend to get mentioned, it's because they're unusual. So average and normal tends not to take up any descriptive space in Scripture.
Except with Jesus.
Except with Jesus. That, at least by all accounts that we get in Scripture, at least based on how things are described, David was better looking than Jesus. If you're going by, are physical features getting described? So, that's my talking to you anyways. So Ruth comes back and she's like, Naomi, I've got all this stuff to tell you. And she's like, where did all this food come from? Like, did you shoplift it? Like, where'd it come from? And so she tells her what goes on. And she tells her, who she met and who she found favor in. And how does Naomi's now character development take a new turn?
She has only conniving.
Oh yeah, Naomi is kind of universally regarded as conniving. Maybe not necessarily maliciously, but conniving.
She quickly does the social calculations in her head.
Yes.
I think she has hope now for herself and for Ruth, and for their property, and that there is a future that they can trust in, either in Boaz or this other kinsman redeemer.
Yeah, there's a sense of hope. She doesn't, pick up her little scorecard and say, all right, is this another family member God's going to knock off? She goes, this is great news. It's great news. You should get married.
Yeah. Oh, she waits a little bit. There's a time jump from chapter 2 to chapter 3.
True. She's like, let this simmer a little
I think
bit.
that's where it starts.
Yeah, and by her reaction, this is where I believe she had no idea they had any living family members left in the area. Because I would have thought if she did, first thing that they arrived is, hey, we need to go find Boaz, or we need to find the next kinsman redeemer, and they need to take us in. And she's like, Boaz is related to us. This is wonderful. And so we do see her character arc having gone through this very dejected point to, hey, God's left a family member alive for us, and a family member who's doing pretty well for himself. There might be hope here. So we only have a few minutes left. Some of the things that I believe the book of Ruth teaches us, and I believe the character arc of Naomi helps to convey, is that we should be very, very, very cautious about assuming we have infallible knowledge of God's intentions towards us. Because it is really easy, especially when things go horribly wrong for years, to think, God must just not like me anymore. I mean, I know we talk about, you shouldn't have this grief for over a year, but if there's always something new coming up every so often, that's really hard to not get bitter and angry and go, God, why is everything that I am given that I think might be a good thing, and it turns sour really quick? But I do remember during some times in seminary when just nothing was going right, and I do mean nothing. And going, Lord, thank you this day for my daily bread, even though this bread is moldy and it makes me sick to eat. It's really hard to think, God still loves me, God knows what he's doing, and he intends good for me, when the physical evidence of what's going on in my life is the exact opposite. So I don't believe we should blame and condemn Naomi for her feelings, but I think the book of Ruth also shows us that Naomi was maybe a little hasty to cast judgment on the situation. I do believe that the book of Ruth, in its purpose, is not about setting up the family lineage of David. I think that's a nice additional thing at the very end, but it's not the bulk of the story. that the bulk of the story surrounds these two women, and so what's going on with them, I believe, must be the purpose of the story. And in ancient literature, you would have, if you all remember some of my lessons from last year on ancient Near Eastern mythology, that a myth story does not mean fictional in their world and their view, and this is how it is often used in literature, but it means that those types of stories are trying to convey how the world works and how one relates to the gods. And I believe Ruth functions as a myth story, again, a true myth story, that it is God's showing tangible evidence of his concern for and ability to save two vulnerable ancient Near Eastern women. You don't really see this elsewhere in ancient Near Eastern literature. But I believe that the purpose of this story is all of these protections and all of this, guidelines for how you treat the poor and how you treat women in the Torah. I believe this story is supposed to be a tangible example of this is what God does for these types of women. Because they are on the outskirts of society. They're not really sure who might love them. And to be quite frank, in their world, if you're a member of the female sex, it's going to be hard. And there are many writings of that time of it would have been better if you were born a man. I believe this story was meant to give hope to women that, yeah, God cares about you. With a caveat that what we learn in wisdom books is this is not how things always go. Sometimes there is not a happy ending. But God can act. God is an unchanging nature. The story might not end up how we want it to end up, but we can be confident in his character. And I do believe that this story is still one that is needed today, and this message. Because as far as we have come in the Western world for the equal treatment of the male and female sexes, we do still see inclinations towards favoritism of one or the other. I know Joy pointed out to me one story that's been in the news ongoing where there was a prison guard here in Texas 3 years ago who she was, 7 months pregnant? She was not allowed to go on medical leave while she was pregnant. She was still required to work in the prison. And she started experiencing a lot of pain while on the job, and her supervisor refused to let her go to the hospital until her shift was over. And when she got there, she was still in a lot of pain. She went, and the doctors told her, your baby has died. And we could have saved your baby if you had gotten here sooner. She then sues the Texas Justice Department, if I have that right. Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The lawsuit began in 2023. And the response from the Attorney General's office here in Texas was, quite frankly, and this was pointed out by other lawyers, that unborn child doesn't have legal rights. Which raised a lot of eyebrows to, isn't Texas supposed to be known for caring for the rights of the unborn? Why is a Republican, criminal justice department saying they want to have their cake and eat it too? And so as far as I know, and as far as I've been able to find out, that litigation is still ongoing. And the Attorney General's office is still trying to pass the buck on to, well, maybe it's just we didn't act right in giving family medical leave, not that the baby has died. And so stuff like this still goes on. Even in places where supposedly Christian values are supposed to be held in high regard, and championed by a party that at least says in word that they defend these things, but at least in this instance, in actuality, it's only said to get votes, at least by how they're acting. So, story of Ruth is still needed. And it should give hope that God notices and God does care, and retribution ultimately comes. So, sorry we're a little over time. I'll pray and get us out of here. Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you for the message of Ruth. Because as short of a story as it is, and how it might have just become quaint and common, these women are essentially at death's door. That they have no legal rights, they have no way to provide for themselves, and they are in a culture that in many ways would value them more if they were men. Thank you for showing that you do care, that you do orchestrate things, even in the midst of us believing that you hate us. Please help us to trust you more, to grieve properly, and to want to honor you no matter how things end. In your Son's name I pray. Amen.